Holy heck, that is a dirty lens. Sorry for everybody about to see this get cleaned. Okay, good enough. Hey, hold on 1 second while we let some people in the room. Got a dirty lens. I also use one of those like lens cover things. So now, how do you clean it with the lens cover thing? So I think I have to take the lens cover thing off and replace it, you know, with another one. I don't know, but now the lens is dirty, so I'm gonna have to fix it. Anyway, welcome to Office Hours with me, Jamie Cohen. As we're gonna talk about what I wrote this week, my last week of school, and we're gonna cover some of the new news that I was like covering for the last few weeks that are more aligned to like media literacy and some of the shifts in the way that young people receive news and information. So I'm going to go over a bunch today during our thing. For those of you who are here, I'm going to leave a note here if you have anything you'd like to add or links to share or anything you want to talk about, share it, please. Share it, please. Okay. So, welcome once again, and welcome to the Office Hours live stream. So, today we're going to be covering a few things, and I'm actually a little relieved because school ended, or the semester ended as in classes, because semester is technically not over until about the end of the month. We have a really late semester. It actually ends around May 28th, I think, is graduation. And I think most universities at that point have all students have already marched across the stage and received their diplomas. Always in scare quotes, because you never receive a diploma, you receive a piece of paper that says coming soon. I did go to all three of my graduations, although I did not really want to go to my first one, my undergraduate one. I remember it. It was the height of the Iraq War. It was about 120 degrees out. We're in our black gowns, and it was outside in the middle of this field. And I remember I had a fever, and so I was like melting out of my fever, like as literally as the graduation ceremony was going on. So that was a poor experience, but pretty much every experience I've had is better since then. But it is always one of those things where it's definitely a lot of work to go to your graduation. But that's in 2 weeks. That means students still have to do their finals. But my classes, my personal classes, ended on Tuesday. And so I want to tell a story about what I covered on Tuesday. Okay, so on Tuesday, I ran this course. Let me give a backstory on this. So I ran this course this semester called SpawnCon, and the course's real name, and I have to read it off because it's actually a fairly long name, is called Commercial Television from Texaco Star Theater to Influencer SpawnCon. Okay, so what that meant is basically it was a television studies course, and I haven't taught television studies in like forever. So this was like it felt really kind of good to go back to my roots, so to speak. And when I say my roots, I mean like basically the work I did when I was a beginning professor, and some of the beginning professor stuff was television studies. And so when I first started doing TV studies, it was basically like this. I came out of the TV industry. I graduated with a television production degree, and so television production is television production is the what's it called? Television production is basically a way of learning how to make television, like literally producing it. And so producing television is a skill, is an art, is anything that really makes the production of it. So one of the fascinating things is I went to school. So here's where this story starts. So I went to school before the end of television. I went to school during what I would call what I would call the gap. That's the term that I continue to use for it. The time I went to school is in between the dot-com crash and YouTube. And so that little bit of time was like this period of transition, of these moments in which we hadn't yet experienced the full scalability of social media, but television itself was still its prime motivator of things being told and stories being told. And television took the hugest prominence ever at this point because 9/11 had just happened. And 9/11 was a big change in television. And so I was taking literally mass media 101 at this point. And mass media 101 taught me how to like read media a lot better, because one of the things that happened after 9/11, which now is taken for granted, is the tickers at the bottom. They used to just show up during breaking news, but then after 9/11, the ticker just became like omnipresent on television. Regardless, middle of George W. Bush's administration, around 2005, he pushed this act out. And the act was called the End of Television Act. That's the name I'm giving it, but it was really like the Digital Transition Act. They were transitioning analog television to digital television. And what that meant is that the technology that we call television was going to end. And the thing I love about the idea of that is that it gives us the opportunity to tell a story about television as both a technology and a format. And how the fact that when you watch television today or you watch media, you are no longer watching television, and yet television persists. The idea of television, it overrides the idea that the technology is no longer there. It's one of the few technologies in the world that has just virtually ended, and yet it continues regardless. So television is an invention, okay? And it's an invention that comes from the 1920s, right after radio became omnipresent. Radio is an invention of the late 19th century, so late 1800s. Radio was basically this way of using electricity and power to push sound out into a wireless landscape, a space where the sound would have to be retrieved by devices. That same technology developed into television, the idea of television. And television is exactly what it sounds like, telegraphy plus vision. Telegraphy being like the fax machine or Morse code or something that runs over wires. And the invention of television is fascinating because it was invented in the late 1920s, but it wasn't until 1948, 20 years after its invention, in which it became kind of a household item, a consumer product. And in 1948 is its real debut. And one of the first shows to debut on television is a show called Texaco Star Theater, an oil company sponsored television production that was hosted by Milton Berle. So this is where I'm going to start the story. So for those of you who are joining, my name is Jamie Cohen. This is my live office hours. I'm going to be talking about my last lecture in my course called SpawnCon this week. And if you have any questions, of course, please drop them in the chat or say whatever. But if you have anything you want to talk about too, I'd love to talk about what you have to talk about. And if you want to explain like how you got here, please leave a note in the chat as well. The chat will disappear after the live stream is done, but it is one of those things where it's an interactive space while I'm streaming. Okay, so back to the story. So in the 1950s, the idea of the heyday or the golden age of television was out there, and television had its own aesthetic. Television's aesthetic was different than film or any of the technology before it because television itself was a technology. It's a small box, and the box held this little piece of technology in it called a CRT, a cathode ray tube, which is basically an electron gun that shot at a wall of phosphors and ignited them, and it turned into the picture on the screen. And that technology dominated, but it was also not omnipresent. People really were like, it was in 1950, it was in one in four houses. So I asked my students, like, what did Texaco Star Theater sell? The show would begin with a bunch of Texaco oilmen singing a little dance song, like minstrel almost. And then they would introduce Milton Berle, who was basically like the godfather of television, of TV personalities, like that was him. And they would do it. So my students, of course, the first thing they would ask on the first day of school is like, well, it must be selling oil. And it's like, well, no, because one of the things you have to keep in mind is that people were already consumers of those products. People already had cars, so they didn't need advertising to sell them more oil. What they needed was a sponsor to promote other things, to create other product that came from it. So Texaco Star Theater's actual role in cultural history is to sell televisions. That's what it did. Because in order for people to get more on board with watching the idea of television or the new technologies known as television and buying a product that would literally sit in your house, where radio was once this audible production that you could move around. Now television required you to sit still and look at a small screen. And I mean small, like the way you're watching it on your laptop or phone is like about the size they would watch it. And they would have to crowd around it. So how do you sell that idea? Well, you have to sell the programming. By 1958, television was nearly in everybody's house in a middle income household. So proliferation worked. It was a decade project and it worked. But that was sponsored content that basically the sponsor had a say in. But the idea of the TV commercial had emerged in 1941, years before. The TV commercial helped develop what we now know as the TV clock. The TV clock is like basically the programming schedule. You watch it at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, but it isn't just that. The clock also includes the television breaks. Because from a very cynical perspective, television is the bookends of the product, the commercials. The commercials are the most important part because that's what's selling you the products that you need to know buy that aren't the sponsored content. It also gives advertising a leeway space of non-influence over the commercial product that you're actually consuming. So if you're watching television, you're not just watching an ad because people feel very cynical about being pushed a product. But in between the ads are these in between the television show are these ads, the advertisements for products that we see. Gave it more space too. And so commercials themselves became an art form, as you can imagine, and they became like this very influential part of how we tell stories about products themselves, and they became a model of programming. The good news about that, and one of the most important parts about advertising as commercials rather than sponsored content, is that with advertising, the consumer technically has control over the media that they see on their screens. I know that sounds weird because we don't think we have any control over anything, but when you're watching TV, when you watch an ad, if you choose not to buy those products anymore from the advertisement, or you choose to boycott that type of programming, the advertising industry reacts almost immediately. They know exactly what they're going to put their money in if it's not going that way. So you could control what you watch by seeing that. Back in that day, we had something called the Nielsen ratings, which were developed in the 1950s and 60s to basically introduce the way that people watched. And every Nielsen family, that's what they were called, represented about 10,000 viewers. And so people would fill these things out and they would basically represent what the viewership is, what we now call ratings. Okay, so the ratings charts of that. In our modern day, it's much more surveillance based, meaning that like they could tell who's watching and how long by analytics, which I could see up here, but like they could see from like the background and they could understand like how many people are actually consuming their product at any given second or moment. That term is called plus seven. That's a whole other discussion. Um, okay. So now let's bring it to the more of the present. So as we go through the semester, we go through all these various forms of television and advertising. I show some great classics like the Coca-Cola Hilltop commercial, and of course the Apple 1984 commercial, and David Fincher's commercials from the 1990s. And then we get into the modern day when the term influencer emerges, which Destiny and I talked about on network issues around the year 2011. All right. So it's like it takes almost to the modern day, like 15 years ago, before a huge cultural shift emerges in which influence emerge. And the term influencer is a marketing term. Okay. It's not just like celebrity or star or character or partner or creator. It's somebody who who has a role in your consuming decisions, and somebody who has a role in how you consume things. And that changes the advertising industry. Of course, it doesn't happen instantly. But let's go back a step or two, okay? The End of Television Act, which was supposed to happen in 2005, doesn't actually happen until under President Obama in 2009. It was actually June 12th, 2009. On that night, literally that night at midnight, the analog broadcast signal, which carried TV to people's houses all over the country and all over the world, the thing that came over the air and brought TV to you, turned off. And it was over. It's like when I watch these videos, I put in my piece today, but when I watch videos like that, I actually get somewhat like emotional. It's like weird because you're actually watching like the end of something. You're watching some technology that was there since the 1940s stop. It just ended and it turned into digital TV. And the thing about digital TV is it releases its technology from its delivery mechanism. And what's beautiful about that is that TV as a technology ends. The CRT, the cathode ray tube, the box televisions discontinue. They're no longer sold in Best Buys. You can't find them. VHS tapes, VCRs, all of these products are no longer accessible or buyable anymore. So you have to have a legacy media to basically operate old TV. And what that leaves us with then is television as the genre, television as the aesthetic, not television as a technology. And I find that amazing because television persists even when the TV technology no longer exists. In other words, there is no outside to television. Everything that is mediated has to think of television in some way because it is the format factor in which we have viewed everything from influencer work to YouTube to structural media production as it streams from the character to the person. Television is its base at its base technology is a technology that turns light into electricity and electricity into light. That's what it does. It just basically takes that. And it still does that. But I really felt at the time in 2008 through now that when we were freed and released from television as a technology, we would have this huge, amazing opportunity to create new media. And in fact, I literally ran a program called New Media because I was so excited to introduce people to a world that was uninhibited by its technological past. And yet, television persists. And what I mean by that is that we still rely on television's structural hegemony to tell stories. The people that become most successful on YouTube and internet spaces are still people who would have been successful on television if it widened out that same way. So the only way you could look sometimes at the internet is an extension of the internet itself, as the internet itself becomes television. And so in 2010, I used to write blogs about this. And when I ran a class, literally at Hofstra, I ran a class called Web Television. Um, I I had a statement that I kept repeating, which was that it wasn't web television, but it was just television on the web. And in 2018, let's see if I can pull that one up. In 2018, I was interviewed by USA Today on this very interesting point about what YouTube is. And I actually had a quote in this piece. I wonder how my computer's going to do today. I have turned it off since. Let's see if I can show you this piece without my computer catching on fire. Sad and terrifying and terrible attempted attack at the YouTube headquarters, and following her subsequent, she took her life right after. What ended up happening was that YouTube itself had become such a popular outlet, but 2017, for those of you who don't remember, 2017 was the year of the adpocalypse. And the adpocalypse was a period of time when YouTube, without telling its creators, shifted its monetization policies based mostly on Logan Paul's walking through the suicide forest in Japan. A little bit more safe. So the way they did that was by controlling their ability to monetize channels. Now, it was making kind of like very controversial, if not very weird content. I would consider it somewhere in the genre of YouTube poop or like very odd types of content. And when she was demonetized, she did not understand why she was demonetized. And her reaction to that wasn't a sane reaction, but rather to go find out where her boss was. Literally, she wanted to go talk to the CEO. That makes no sense in the form of YouTube, which exists as this massive, I would almost say at this point, object of media. And so she went there and shot the door several times and then took her own life, which is extremely sad. And honestly, the more I tell the story of a creator, the more it really feels it hurts almost, you know. But I had this quote in here that ended up going around. And in fact, the quote appears in a lot of different places. The quote appears in a lot of different places that aren't in this article. And here's what I wrote. Here's what I was asked. They were asking me questions about this. As YouTube is pushed to take a firmer grasp on the content it disseminates, some of those responsible for helping make the site popular won't make the transition, says me. I like how they call it the school media. That is generous. It was a new media department inside the communications department, which had, I think, 22 majors, but it was definitely something I was major part of. YouTube is inevitably heading toward being like television, but they never told their creators this. Some have understood this mission and just adjusted, finding YouTube to be the only outlet for their content, but others reacted differently. And that's quite an understatement considering Nassim Magdad's reaction of shooting the San Bruno off, taking her own life. Again, for those of you who are here, if you have any comments or questions, please leave some notes in the chat. I'd love to talk to you about it. And if you want to leave a note of how you found the stream or what you want to talk about, that's still here. So the reason why this note went viral has a lot to do with even just things that people are talking about to this day, which is that there's an ongoing thought process today about there's nothing to watch on YouTube. And and it just reminds me of the times that you could have 1,000 TV channels and there's nothing to watch on TV. So it's like YouTube has become TV. It is not alternative media, it is television, but on the web. And so it's still the same. And that brings me to my final lecture that I had in my SpawnCon course, which is that as we reach the 2020s, we're now almost 2 decades removed from the end of television, and legally, technically, fully 2 decades. But it leaves us in a part of like, if we could just be free of television, what would we create? What would we design? And the funniest part is what we designed turned out to just be TV again. It is wild to me that this keeps happening. Um, okay, so American Family Insurance decides that they're going to create SpawnCon. They decide that they're going to create sponsored content on a show called American Family Insurance Designs Designed to Last on Hulu. Okay. It just came out. Okay. You can see it's a brand new TV show. It is a Hulu show built with clocks, by the way. It does fade to black. It has commercial breaks, even though it's on Hulu. I do pay for Hulu Premium, so maybe there is commercial breaks that I'm just not seeing. But it is cut like a television show. In fact, when it says this, a first of its kind branded reality competition series, it is fascinating to me because it is the, I don't know, 10,000th of its kind. It honestly is just a really well-made reality television show. That's the only way I could describe it. It's a competition reality show and it's really well done, but it's the exact formula as reality TV. Now, most of my TV experience has been in SpawnCon, meaning that I would do television productions that was sponsored. And so one of my first reality shows I worked on was at MTVU, and MTVU was MTV's College Network, and it was sponsored by Yahoo and Motorola. And so I remember many times having to speak directly to our contestants. Also, very crude the fact you don't call them people; they aren't cast members; they are contestants. If it's reality TV and it's game show style, which is any form of competition, it's a game show, which means they're contestants. They are competing against each other. We had to like sneak in lines into the contestants' work. So like I'd have to say things that they would never say. Be like, "Hey, listen, when you say you're texting your friend, can you say I'm texting my friend on a Motorola phone?" And they'd be like, "No." And I'd say, "Well, listen, you signed the contract, and that means you have to say that. Let's find a way to make you say this line, this phrase, this sponsored content line better." And you know what? It they did, and it didn't sound authentic, but that's not what the sponsor cares about. They care about their slogans going in. So when I watched this show, Designed to Last, it's got the very typical opening sequence. It's got this very typical TV set, and I could hear, because I'm very tuned into it, I could hear the lines and the phrases necessary for the sponsored content. Something I didn't add to my piece today, which is called Finding Hope in the Age of, or the Time of Insurance. What did I call it? Finding Hope in the Time of Insurance Company Reality Television SpawnCon. What I didn't mention is that I do have a quite an understanding of this type of formatting because my dad was a safety engineer for an insurance company, and so my whole entire life has been like framed by his experience in insurance, doing exactly this, which is loss risk or risk loss analysis and mitigation. And so this show is really about that. Okay. But what was really fascinating about this show, about Designed to Last, is that the show is about climate change. It is literally about climate change. They just never, ever, ever, ever say the words climate change ever in the show. What they talk about is natural, I'm putting scare quotes in this, natural disasters and weather events. And they basically are insinuating that those once in 100-year storms are now going to be once a year storms. And this makes sense from an insurance perspective. If you have insurance rates stay low because people aren't using the insurance. The more people that use insurance, the higher your insurance rates get. And so it makes sense for an insurance company to want to sponsor a risk or a loss mitigation show, like a loss mitigation process. And the reason they want to sponsor a show like that is because the more people they can convince to prepare better for natural disasters, the less claims they're going to get, the more it keeps those prices down. Insurance companies make their money because people aren't doing claims. Okay. So they're not actually doing the claims. They're, not using their insurance. So the insurance company's profiting. The more people that use the claims, the less profit an insurance company makes. Makes sense. However, what doesn't make sense is that while they're showing this very fascinating scene that's on the screen right now, they called it the Miami-Dade hurricane test, which is like horrifying, like that they called that, in which they basically fly two by fours through these little houses that they're competing with at like 140 miles per hour, which is like basically deadly. You know what I mean. You can see the three major fans set up, and then you can see the reactions of the cast members or the contestants as they watch their house get destroyed by a two by four. Um, and so I had to explain to the students what SpawnCon does. When SpawnCon operates as a format or a television media format, it removes consumer choice. When consumers have a choice over the media they watch, it's because the advertisers basically are participating with the audience in the ads that must go on TV and go to their audience. When it's sponsored, there is no more consumer choice. You are watching only the advertisement. That's why I put the McLuhan quote in this piece, because McLuhan in 1966 basically prophesied this. It wasn't hard to prophesy if you were McLuhan, because he was like basically in this, like studied this so intensely. He wrote, or he said during a live stream, he wrote, "Where advertising is heading is quite simply into a world where the ad will become a substitute for the product, and all the satisfactions will be derived informationally from the ad, and the product will merely be a number in some file somewhere." He's predicting technical media or digital media. That's what he's predicting. But what he's really saying is like eventually the advertisement is the product. And that's exactly what this show is. This show is the product. Now, when you explain climate change to students, it doesn't typically go over well. So I said I had to stop the course and I had to basically interject and say, hey, we need to talk about this. All right. Because if you're going to watch a Spawn Con about insurance mitigation, you're going to have to understand why. And so I brought up just about three major things that have happened recently. Most importantly, and this is about to shift right now. So for those of you who are just joining, or if you're here, you're just tuning to the stream halfway, I'm about to talk about climate change. Okay. So climate change, as you know, is real. And with that, when I refer to climate change, I mean human influenced changes in climate. Okay, that's what I'm basically talking about. That human beings and their carbon use have increased the temperature of Earth, which is now increasing massive problems. A little fun fact, well, not fun at all, is that in the last 120 years, we have raised the global temperature more and quickly than any time in Earth history. Not our history, Earth history, as in like 4.6 billion years of time. Temperatures have been hotter than this many times, but never has it been going from where it started to this heat thing in the history of the planet. In other words, there's no geological precedent for what happens as a result. In addition to that, when we build things or like create structures or anything, we take what's in the earth and we move it above the earth. And we forget too that like oil and carbon materials are technically finite, but we do have enough reserves on the planet. And we do forget that the reason we have oil or carbon or any of these things is because of fossils. They're just literally why they're called fossil fuels. You have to kind of conceptualize how many millions of years of dinosaurs existed at the exact same time for them to be compressed into oil. So the oil you're burning in your car was once a dinosaur, and not just a dinosaur, but like an amalgamation of millions of years of them. And so we can't conceptualize that because human beings, as Homo sapiens, have been around for about 40,000 years. And human beings as a species have been around for about 3 million. And 3 million makes no sense in the terms of like 220 million years of dinosaurs, So it's, we've been here for a very short time. And in a very short time, we've done this. The news recently that has been like what made my students upset were these three pieces. One, the president has rolled back limitations on toxic gas called ethylene oxide. Basically, the presence of this specific gas can make you get cancer like right away. It increases your chances of cancer by like 60%. So that's not great. In March, Trump canceled a handful of NOAA grants, which is, the thing that tracks weather. So this show, if you A to B here, you see like, oh, we don't know what weather is coming. Better make sure your house is safe. You know what I'm saying? Like it basically has that A B concept going on there. Well, that was like more of a 6 7 type thing. But the idea there is that you, in the absence of information, you should be prepared for these storms because you may not know them in advance. Okay. And the third one that I think upset the students the most, and I should have framed it better in my essay, but this is how I asked it. I said to my students, who are all New York City students, have you ever walked through Central Park? And about two-thirds raise their hand, which is also somewhat embarrassing because, like, if you live in New York, but again, this is Queens. Queens, you've seen enough Spider-Man and like comic books to know that regions of New York City don't always move over to other places. Anyway, if you or anybody who's watching this has walked Central Park, you should know that it's big. It's huge. It's a huge park. It runs from 59th Street all the way up to northern Harlem, and it's like an amazingly huge and beautiful park. And somebody, as a facetious joke, which cute, whatever, it's fine. It's more facetious than not, decided to make a little joke on X saying, you know what we should do with Central Park? We should just turn that into a data center. And basically, it's a joke because we're putting data centers all over. This is the tweet. Now, that's the joke on that. And here's the reality that if somebody were to build a data center on Central Park, it would only be 5% the size of the proposed Box Elder County data center in Utah, the one that Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank is sponsoring. The one that he says anybody who avoids or anybody who doesn't want this data center that will be seen from outer space, that will drink half of the water of all of the state of Utah, that will use more electricity than any structure on planet Earth currently. The reason you don't like it is because of propaganda, because of people infiltrating you. When he basically dismantles the idea or tries to discount the idea that realistically, you don't want a data center the size of this because it will be disastrous. It will produce on a daily basis enough power of basically an atomic weapon going off every single day. It will emit immense amounts of heat that everything nearby will most likely be cooked just to store generative AI, data, and all of these things that basically aren't really asked for anymore, but have to scale because capitalism has to do. And when you build a data center of that immense size, you're going to alter the environment. One way or another, it's going to get altered, which means climate risks are going to increase more than you can imagine. And whatever you imagine is our current temperature problems that you see, and these once in 100-year storms now become once in a yearly storm. So it makes sense for SpawnCon to be completely built by an insurance company to basically mask the idea that it's not reality TV, but you're basically being trained how to watch disaster relief content. And as you can imagine, and if you can't imagine, I'm going to tell you, the students were really, really upset. and this is my fault. I went a little too hard. This is my fault. In my grad school experience in both master's and PhD, I took an eco-crit course. And eco-criticism is a course that basically trains you to ingest or interpret climate data into a storyline so you can understand it better. In both versions of those classes, they both start with the book The Road. And after you're done reading The Road and crying and feeling sick, the teacher usually goes, okay, now that we're done with the light stuff, and then you're introduced directly into what climate does, so it's pretty devastating. But for me, I'm like, oh, okay, we're just going to talk about it. For the students, they're like, what's the point of going on? And I was like, fuck, I overdid it. I overstepped. I went a little too hard. So it resulted in me having to give a little bit of hope. And that's where I think a little bit of these things come from. It's like, what do you do in the face of these choices? And the way that we know that to say that if insurance company SpawnCon exists, then that gives you a baseline. So here's what I gave as a takeaway to my students. And here's the important parts here. And maybe another piece of content or something else, I'd add graphics to this. I don't have OBS or any way of adding graphics to the screen, but here's what it basically said. One, you're living through the end of television. You've been living through it. And what I mean by that isn't just the idea that the technology has ended. It's also like, you have to understand that like the free press, Barry Weiss, has taken over CBS News. And when she took over CBS News, what you're actually watching is the end of a long legacy of what that version of television looked like. And to end up in a place where that TV, that format, kind of is being reconstructed with political agendas means that the idea of television is ending. So technology's gone, the structural basis is gone. Television has become an advertisement as you're watching it. Like it's the end of things. But whenever you talk about the end of things, you are also talking about the beginning of things. The beginning overlaps the endings quite significantly. And if you don't pay attention to the beginning of things, you're going to just re-engage or basically participate in the former end of things rather than getting into the new of things. And it's such to me, it's wildly exciting. Like I was in a weird way, I feel really, really hopeful and excited for my students. And one of my students interjected. She said literally out loud, she goes, "Listen, I know you're saying this from a space of experience. You're up there and you're able to talk about this, but we're here in these seats. We're sitting here and we don't really have a view of a better future. We only have like what we're going through, and only hearing this from you, all these negative things, doesn't really help our outlook." And I said, "That's absolutely fair. That is a fair criticism. Me, I'm 20 years their elder, and I'm got a tenured position at a college. I'm okay, but I'm living with them at the same time, and I have little babies, I have children, so it's like I have to have a radically optimistic view of this and a view of hope. But aside from that, I also have to have an extreme level of faith in my students. Extreme, because it's my job. It's literally my job to have faith in them, and I have to help them construct that type of faith. And it's really important for me to remind them that we are in this together. And when I read one of Jenny Chang's decks, it's called "Escape from the Wasteland." Towards the very end of that deck, there's a still in the lower right corner that really like it's one of those images that you see and you're just like, oof, like you're just like that's a lot to like take in. And so it reminded me of this. And so this is a really big important moment that I've shared with the students because very often feel really cynical and they're like, well, what chance do we have? What life do we have? What future can we build? And I said, anybody asks the question of what can I do? There's only one answer: anything. Do anything. Like that's it. It just feels like so you could get filled with so much like overwhelming cynicism and overwhelming feelings of like hopelessness and helplessness. And when it really comes down to it, you just have to remember like you can do anything because doing anything is better than not doing anything. You have to do something. And that was like, I was really excited for them in a weird way. I know that made them feel really upset, the fact that there is this doomism and doomerism coming out from every angle around them. They didn't ask for any of these things. Whereas millennials basically lived through transition after transition after transition. Our four ages were watching things collapse over and over and over again. Gen Z kind of inherits a world that is collapsed. And so they're in the rubble, but that should be in a weird way to relook at that as an opportunity to do something new. I don't want to say better yet because that may not be accessible, but something new. And I saw Sophia post when my students from Salzburg that it's like it's time to be weird. It's time to start to think about things out of the box. Time to think of things that aren't your typical. Here is how things have done. This is what we do, and it's time to like embrace that because otherwise it just keeps going. And we have to, as the best of our abilities, we have to push back as much as possible against these data centers. We have to push back against these anti-human, anti-earth technologies that are really taking away from futures. We have to imagine an equitable future because if we cannot, we lose that power and those things that are like allow us to have agency in these worlds, like to have that. But even in the lack of all of that control, you still have choice. You still have that ability. And what I did find is nice is that shows like shows like uh, uh, what's it called? How do I forget the name of the TV show already? Designed to Last are actually provocations. They allow us to have these conversations. And for those of you who are like read my newsletter, have stuck with it, you may remember me getting lighter on the provocateurs. Not to be hateful as much as I used to be, because hate and anger doesn't really go over as well. Um, and so sometimes it's important to embrace the provocation and say, okay, now that we have this, it gives us these opportunities to talk about these things. We didn't ask for the show Designed to Last, but Designed to Last now is a repurposable conversation. It is both a conversation about how advertising has shifted in the 2020s, how sponsored content operates, and how to talk about climate change without talking about climate change. The show is very smart. It's smart because it knows it can't say certain terms because certain audiences will not watch because they hear terms and turn their brain off. But this show does give the opportunity, albeit coded through insurance companies, to manage and prepare a future of uncertainty. And that's control. That is some sort of control. That is some tool set for the future. Could it be better? Of course, it could be better. The show could obviously offer some opportunities that aren't competitive, aren't putting designers against other designers to show how to make the best 2x4 proof house. They could be showing how to create collective movements or like create mutual aid. Are they going to do that? And no, it's not profitable. But they can show that, but I can say that, and it gives me the ability to have that doorway because the show exists, and it gives me the opportunity to talk about that and talk about how we don't just need to prepare our houses. We need to prepare our communities. We need to prepare our friends. We most importantly need to prepare our students, and we need to prepare our children. We need to, because we need to talk about this in a very, very, very explicit way. And I note in here that, and I've brought it up on previous streams before, that I use this quote that kind of drives my pedagogy, which is it comes from the book Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. The heartbreaking necessity of lying about reality and the heartbreaking impossibility of lying about it. It basically means you need to lie about what's real because it hurts, but it's impossible. It's heartbreaking. It's impossible not to talk about reality. You have to. You have to. It's our responsibility. If you don't take these responsibilities, you let somebody else take those responsibilities. And as to refer to Jenny Chang's other decks, she once said, "Remember, hate speech is never paywalled." Okay, just keep that in mind. Usually, knowledge is paywalled. It means that you have to pay for that information. It's something that's performed. But things that are simple, things that don't require thought or just engage your deepest, darkest parts of your soul, like anger and an animosity, they're typically free. Okay, that's just typically how it works because they're not aiming for the same thing. They're probably engaging in a whole other form of monetization, or they're funded by some sort of form of dark money. So it's complicated, I guess is the best way to say it. But in its complications, offers us that ability to talk, to say things. Because, like I said, I write it here at the end of the thing. Typically, in previous years, I'd have the opportunity to explain what's coming next. What's the industry going to look like? Where are you going? What jobs are out there? And now I actually don't know. It's probably the same, but there's probably things that we don't even know yet. And while it's terrifying and scary, the upside is none of us know. That's great. That's awesome. That means we're in this together. I love that. Like, and so I made my usual promise that no matter what happens, like we're in it together. Like there's as long as I have this job, like I do, and I told my students, I might come from a space of safety where I'm a professor and like having a position in a tenured thing, but it would be extremely naive for any of us, anybody watching this, anybody in my classes, it would be naive of us to think that education as an industry, as a job, as a career is a safe space, knowing how things are going. We just don't know. And so we're just do our best. We do our best. And that's what my class was about. And I think by the end, they kind of got it, but they were upset. Upset. And so there's a note here. I'll leave one more thing before I transition to the next part here. This maybe is some good advice. Maybe this summer, you just join the cicadas and scream. Maybe that's the best thing you could do. All right, on another note, you want to see something cool? Things have changed. So on this note, which kind of brings us from the first part, is I want to talk about this piece. The evolving news landscape, comparing media habits and trust between teens and adults. And what was fascinating is that this is a story about how young people are getting their news. This survey is corroborated in other outlets as well. This is just not paywalled, so I have access to this one. Um, 7 to 10 American teenagers pay for some kind of news product or service. That's great, right? 7 out of 10. 56 directly, and another 23% through another person's subscription or membership. So, of course, they're still getting news. They're just getting it through somebody else's. Um, and 54% of 8 through 34 pay for something that is most likely to be video or TV. Teens rely mostly on social media, while older adults remain deeply connected to television and print-based news, which is just like what we've been talking about this whole time. Younger people are less likely to use or pay for several types of traditional news products, despite high levels of daily engagement with news content. For all that, nearly half of teens and adults still watch TV in some form of it all day. So TV is still a thing. Local news continues to occupy an essential role in the landscape, though it is one of the most threatened sectors of journalism. It's increasingly unclear what business model will be able to sustain journalism in smaller markets. Local news is generally more trusted. One note about that, interjection here, before I go on. Local news is the most important form of news we could have, which is why the destruction of local news over the course of the last decade and a half by Mark Zuckerberg and his ilk has been terrible for news information gathering. Local news is the most important news you can get because it matters to you locally. It matters to your community. It tells the story about what impacts you directly. Everything impacts you directly one way or another, but typically when we're talking about global news or national news, it's information that affects you later. Okay, but local news affects you typically pretty instantly. So local news continues to occupy an essential role of the media landscape, okay? But it is constantly threatened. Local news is more trusted. That's another good part about this. Having local news means that you're part of something we feel more veracity because you, as a citizen and as a news reader, can actually corroborate the information. Whereas generally bigger news, financial news, global news, you can't go check. You have to trust the journalist that they're telling the truth, which in a time of like rage bait is actually fairly difficult to create a veracity behind it. And also in the age of like, I want to call it like information laundering or propaganda laundering. Like example, like when Trump falls asleep at his desk and like the press asks Caroline Levitt or the spokesperson, like, is he sleeping? And they go, oh no, he's having meetings with God. It's like, the news just prints that. Oh, Trump isn't sleeping, he's having meetings with God. Like that's laundering something. It's like that is because of the way power structures operate. Whereas local news, you can literally get in your car or you get on your bike or you can take a walk and go check. You can go look. Okay. So that's why local news is important. And then what ends up happening, and this is a call to action, which is really important, which is that here it is right here. Only a quarter of teens and adults say that influencer independent creators are better than other sources of news at treating all sides fairly, helping people understand the world around them. Local and national news are not far ahead. 3 in 10 saying that 2 sources are best treating sides fairly. So they basically influencer news gathering is not objective; it's more subjective. Most teens do not use AI for news information, which is great news. Okay. And in the end, what it basically says as a big study, and here it is again with a nice, let me switch to this tab. Let's do this one. Bloop. Nice blocker in it. And I don't have an account, nor do I want to sign in. Let's see if I can just refresh it. It's probably going to block me anyway. Social media, quickly before the thing popped up. 50% of young people now see imps or influencers who do news gathering and news dissemination and news storytelling as their main source of news information. When I ask my students about news avoidance, which is a huge thing since 2016, wonder what happened in 2016. Since 2016, news avoidance has increased by 40%, meaning that I guess decreased, or I don't know how to do the math, but 40% of all viewership has dropped of news in general because people are avoiding it. In other words, they just don't like to tune into news because it's either too depressing or it is something that isn't part of their daily media habit. And so that's depressing as shit. But where that has disappeared, in the end of that, as Barry Weiss, a blogger who has never done any hard news ever, takes over one of the most legacy versions of news that has ever basically it's the beginning of news. Edward R. Murrow was on CBS during See It Now when he basically invited the audience into um, cultural politics and talked about what the Red Scare was happening in the Senate at that time. Like that model of news is now over. You have this woman who's extremely biased, who has a very specific and very naive view of how news is done, in charge of the news at CBS. Like, and it's kind of like sad. It's embarrassing. But in that ending is the opportunity of a beginning. That's what I'm saying. That's what I've been saying about this whole thing, is that all of these things may end, but the opportunity for young people to get involved, and this is my call to action, is super high. Don't just do local news. Create local news content. Go and get reporters. Go talk to people. Microphones are like this big. I just got this gimbal, like this crazy gimbal, and it like comes with a receiver from DJI where you can just have this little microphone for 45 bucks. And you can plug your phone in and basically make extremely high level consumer news product that can do local news reporting. Because right now it looks like Gen Z and soon Gen Alpha will be receiving their news primarily from influencer content. And that means the pressure's on because you have to tell real stories as a news gatherer. But it's also like an opportunity to rebuild local news from the bottom up. Rebuild it while it's been destroyed, by taking away from Mark Zuckerberg and the capitalist ilk that basically optimizes clicks over any type of factual information or democracy engaging information. It's time. All right. That's my advice to you. So I find that as good. Last note is me quoted in another article I loved. Okay, last bit here before we close up shop. Thank you for everybody who is here. Thank you for anybody who's watching. I really appreciate this. You guys doing this and taking the time out of your day to see me rant about what I do in my class. This piece I was quoted in for Sherwood, written by Max Knobloch, who went to Hofstra. It's AI live, which is Josh likes doing that, connecting AI to other words. So it's AI live, Dead Ring it's called. AI is giving life to the resurrection economy by Max Knobloch. It's basically about the estates of very famous people offering identities of very famous actors to AI tools. And one of the main examples here is this example, As Deep as the Grave, which is a film that Val Kilmer was cast in, and then Val Kilmer died. Val Kilmer did not look like this when he died. And I made a joke that As Deep as the Grave is a shallow ass grave, okay? Because there he is. That is not Val Kilmer. That's Val AI Kilmer. That's AI. That is not Val Kilmer. That is a AI reproduction of Val Kilmer, which is it's grim. Okay, I'm sorry, that's pretty grim. So talking this through, I mean, I talk about this quite often, but here's James Earl Jones. You may or may not know. In 2022, James Earl Jones, you know James Earl Jones is, reached agreement with Disney to recreate his voice using AI for the future Star Wars projects. He did pass away in 2024, but he continues to be alive and say the most amazing thing Darth Vader has ever said in any of the Darth Vader films: "Skibbity toilet." Okay, that's what he said many times in Star Wars films. So he continues to say so today. I think somewhere in here it is. Yeah. He's got Darth Vader's talking about Mater from Cars, and here's a clip of Darth Vader saying "Skibbity toilet." I'm not clicking through on that in James Earl Jones's voice. Cool. So I have a bite here about 11 Labs and their ability to basically do cloning. Okay, voice cloning. Anyone could do voice cloning. You basically need a sample set that's big enough, and you load all the voice into it, and you could recreate somebody else's voice using these labs. So I'll just forward it with this little paragraph here. AI's use case as a resurrector seems to fit with a broader existential market technique that have been used to boost the tech over the past few years. The AI models may be able to bring back beloved dead celebrities, which fits neatly into the narrative that text powers are limitless, or that certain models are too dangerous to release. All these catchphrases. While 11 Labs celebrity voice deals are a large part of external marketing, the company's own financial announcements imply that most of its recent revenue growth comes from enterprise clients using 11 Labs. So enterprise meaning like licensing. I say the whole industry is based on evangelism, which I am certain of. Evangelism means that the reason why AI industries work and the way people talk about pro AI stuff, the reason they're pro AI is because they have to be because they're evangelizing the product. Excuse me. It means you have to be pro AI so you can support your own love of AI. Okay, it's good evangelism. Um, Companies are projecting their own use cases onto the consumer. This is sort of like that commencement speaker who got booed last week. She's projecting. She believes her use case applies to all people she's speaking to. So, excuse me, when somebody is pro AI, oftentimes they're projecting their pro AI use onto your maybe neutral AI use. So what they're doing is assuming a market exists that is like, I don't have to choose this new voice. I can have Jerry Garcia's voice for my book. And I say I'm seeing more micro markets emerge as AI struggles find reliable revenue because they're a sink. You guys probably know that, and if you don't, they sink. Um, OpenAI is like $160 billion in debt, which is why they're constantly asking the U.S. government for contracts so they can support themselves. Also, you're really screwing with the people's way to interpret trust in media too. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the glaring problems they're potentially creating with this. In other words, I'm not a clue in here, but what I'm saying is that what you're building when you're creating like AI cloning technologies or any type of material or technology in which the realness is being simulated, not reality, you don't realize later, 5 to 10 years from now, what damage that can cause when people are simulating things that definitely shouldn't be simulated. So that could be a problem. It also causes those weird mind fuckery things like Mandela effect. Like, I don't know if you remember, but like at the end of Game of Thrones, there was a mistake where one of the cast members left a Starbucks cup on a table and it was seen in the background. And simply, technologically, we were allowed to, they CG'd it out, just erased, and then re-aired it. So now you can't see that unless you have screen grabs of it. It just simply doesn't exist. So when you have voice cloning or digital AI, any type of recreation technologies, you're kind of fucking with the audience. All right. And it's really not nice because, in a way, that makes people's ability to trust what they watch, it reduces that trust really low. And so it creates a cynicism just by doing it. And so that was my point in that Sherwood piece. And I'll just drop the quote here in case anybody wants that article to look at it. I had a lot of fun talking to Max about it, and he's a great writer. And Sherwood, I think Sherwood's one of my favorite outlets. It's mostly business, but this was really a really good piece into the industry and how things are shifting. And as you know, well, if you don't know by now, if you're attuned into this live stream, you do know that I'm not, as I always say, I'm not anti AI. I'm anti pro AI. That is what it's really about. Yes, and thank you. Yeah, Baudrillard's simulacra and simulation definitely comes to mind. It's almost like at this point, you almost have to look at it like we're in stage 4 of the image. Like there is just no reality, and so that creates that cynicism because yeah, this it's weird that the movie industry is just like, hey, let's lean into the Matrix. Let's not, you know, not like, oh, let's use it as a warning. What was that? That's like a funny joke online, which is like an author writes a book about the death machine, and Silicon Valley's like, hey, let's make this the death machine. It's kind of like that type of cynical use of a technology. So yeah, if you, I appreciate that look. Yeah, it is very much like Baudrillard's postmodern look. I did my master's on postmodernism and Baudrillard. That was like my theory structure underneath it. And I remember when I graduated, people were like, postmodernism? Who's going to need postmodernism? What a dumb theory. And then 26 came around and people was like, oh, yeah, we're probably going to need that type of theory. And I'm very fortunate right now that one of my graduate students, my advisee, my thesis advisee, is doing his thesis on a similar structure using Baudrillard as a structural theory too. And I'm like, yes, all right, we're not done. So all that to say, thank you for being here. That's the end of my office hours live. I appreciate you watching, being here, and whoever's watching the replay and the live stream replay. Please email me, contact me, leave notes, send me an email with things you want to hear next. You can find me on this YouTube channel. You can watch Network Issues with me and Destiny Day on our Instagram channel and on this YouTube. You can also find my work on newmediahomework.substack.com. And you can follow my Instagram at Jamie Cohen, which kind of is just a place I post stories at this point. But thank you for being here. And I hope to see you next week, 1 o'clock, every Thursday at 1 o'clock at newanddigital.com, which is the hard link for this live stream. Thanks again for being here, and be curious, be vigilant, and persist.